Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm Laura Kane, and I'm with Dr. Stanley. Say it for me, Stanley.
Rabinowitz.
Rabinowitz.
I've had a lot more practice than you've had, so it's good.
Sure. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. We know that the growth models are maybe not the most exciting topics, but
this is very exciting.
So it's one that we're proud to present, and I'm with one of the experts in the industry, so it's a pleasure to be with you today. So again, please make sure you've joined that EdWeb. It's free, so it costs you nothing, and there are many benefits to having joined this community, not just the recordings like you're going to participate in today and earning those certificates, but you're able to download the slides, you're able to look at those chat logs, you're able to go online for those line discussions, and then to get some free resources. So I highly suggest you do this and encourage your other colleagues to do the same. Stanley, I'd like you to introduce yourself a little bit and tell our participants a little bit about yourself.
Sure, we'll keep this nice and short, but right now I'm a senior technical advisor at Pearson. Been doing that just for the last 4 months, so it's a new role for me. What's most relevant to today is for the last 20 plus years, I've been building assessment and accountability systems in almost half the states I've gotten to work with and nationally. And for the last 5 years before I started at Pearson, I actually moved to Australia, where I ran the National Assessment and Reporting Program. So I can bring a perspective not just from most of the US states, but also a whole lot of international experience. So that's what I'll be using today for my presentation.
Thank you, Stanley. Oops, I went too far. And I'm Laura Kane. And like Stanley, I started my career in the classroom. I started as a high school English teacher and have moved through the ranks from running a building to many positions in central office. Before joining Pearson for the last 10 years, I worked for an urban school district, and assessment was one of my departments, as well as professional learning. And I also had the opportunity to manage a TIF grant, which we were challenged with creating a human capital management system, and that included how do we measure growth in terms of teacher evaluation and even in our district. So I have a little bit of experience, but not near the experience that Stanley has in this, but I sure have an interest. And that's kind of what propelled us to come up with this topic and share with you today. So I'm really happy to be here. I live in Indiana and have lived in Indiana all my life. I for sure don't have the awesome experiences that Stanley has. I've been here in the Midwest and enjoying a really cold spring. Don't know about that. So the topic is understanding growth models and how they impact teacher and school evaluations. I think this is has become not a new topic. It's been around for a while, but we felt like it was really important to maybe talk about it today and share with you our knowledge on that. Just for a moment to pause and tell you a little bit about the division of Pearson that we work for. We're a really large company, as I'm finding out. I've only been in this role, much like Stanley, I've been here right at just over a year. And what I'm finding is that there are multiple divisions. Our particular part of the company is centered around school assessment, particularly a K-12, whether that's at the district level or the state level. But having come to Pearson, I couldn't be happier to be part of a company that truly does care about learner outcomes, and that's the heart of everything we do. I've not been disappointed in making this change from being in public education my entire career to now coming to a company that truly cares about the learner, but also cares about the adult, and that professional learning piece means a lot to me. So I've not been at all disappointed in this giant career move for me. I'm learning a lot, and hopefully you'll feel the same way. And that last line of this slide means a lot to me too, and that's fewer, better tests that are accessible to everyone. And that's truly a mission of the company, and I'm proud to be a part of it. So I'm going to turn most of the presentation right now over to Stanley, and he's going to get started a little bit about the presentation and growth, and I'll monitor your questions as they come up. I'll stop him if there's something that I feel like a great time to pause. So,
And Laura, looks like we've got one already and we haven't even started. This is great. This crowd is into this. Welcome. I really appreciate you all joining in, those of you who are live and those who will see this on tape. So I'm going to start real basic. Growth, it's the hottest thing around, but I'm going to push us back a bit and say why. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of trouble. It's a lot of benefit potentially, but I really want to start off focusing on why should we measure growth? What are the advantages? What are the challenges? What should you think about? Not just say it's a fad, I'm going to do growth. Kids should grow, so I want to measure it. I really want to challenge you to be very specific about what you expect to get out of a growth model. And I'll give you some examples. Your growth model is only good as your assessment that you use to measure growth, if that's what you're using. So what are characteristics of appropriate assessments that you might use to measure growth? And then, as I said, growth is hard. So we're going to talk about what factors are specific to measuring growth that you need to consider that go beyond just the test you may use. It's the model, it's the research behind it, it's the purposes, it's the reports, it's your audiences. So we're going to get really drilling down to factors specific to growth. What I'm not going to do today is recommend a growth model. What I'm going to give you, I hope, the tools so you can pick the growth model and the growth accountability system that's most appropriate for your values, your history, and your stakeholders. Finally, we'll talk about some technical criteria that you could use to evaluate your growth model. Okay, so let's start. Why growth? Other than the feds, I think, want me to do it, or my state is doing it, or I like growth, it's better than non-growth, or we want kids to grow. So the first step I'm going to ask you to take, the first question I'm going to ask you to consider as you're going through this exercise is, what's your theory of action? What should happen because you're measuring growth? Do you expect better evaluation? Do you expect behavior to change? Do you expect stakeholders to react differently to your school? I'm going to give you my bias in a second why you should do growth, but right now I want you to just take 30 seconds to think about, have we really thought about why we're doing growth other than it's just a fad? Okay, we're going to stop. I know dead air is deadly on these things, but I'm going to take that risk that you're not going to switch over to something else. You're really going to think about, what do you expect to get out of your growth model? So here's why I would do it. In my mind, learning is multidimensional. That it's real important how high you achieve. But the only way to be a high achiever is to grow into it. Especially for low-performing schools or low-performing children or at-risk children. And those three terms I've got on the bottom of this box, reliable and valid and fair. In my mind, the most important reason for doing growth is that, unfortunately, in the world we live in, not every student or not every school can be a high-achieving school. We want them to be, that's our hope. But there are a lot of factors that affect achievement. But I truly believe, and we'll show you a slide with examples, that every school or every student can be a high growth student, a high growth school, regardless of where they are. And the most valid and reliable and fairest models look at a school, look at a child where they are, and then measure their growth from that starting point. So to me, the value of growth is this multidimensional view of what effective schooling is, that everybody needs to be achieving to a certain level. It's what I call the Disneyland test or the amusement park test. You know what that is? That is, I don't care how much you grew last year. If your little head doesn't get to that line, you're not getting on the ride. But the only way most kids can get to that ride, especially the shortest ones or the ones that are starting the furthest behind, is to grow. And everybody wants to get on that ride, wants to get to proficient, wants to go beyond proficient. But it's the measures of growth that keep every school in the game. I've heard a lot of schools, I've been doing this, and Laura and I, we won't mention how many years we've been doing this in how many different places. And we hear the stories about how hard it is to get kids to be proficient or beyond that. But if I give you an opportunity to show that you are doing your job through a growth model where your kids are growing every year and your school is moving the mark every year in the right direction, and I build that into an accountability model that doesn't do away with achievement, with status, but balances status and achievement depending where you are on your journey, then we can now have a reliable, valid, and fair system that every school, that every teacher, and every student can buy into. Because as I said, everybody may not be able to get on that ride today, but with enough work and with the right model, you can get closer to being on that ride and eventually get there. So that's, to me, why growth. So my theory of action is that because I have growth as part of my accountability model, I can motivate all schools, all students, all teachers that they will be treated fairly by the accountability system. And then you locally can say, how are you going to use the data for that theory? What does the use of a growth data model and the actual information you get, how does that change instructional practices? How does it change the way your public looks at your schools, your stakeholders, your parents, the politicians, the state officials? It's very important to be very explicit there. So what's your purpose? Is it school accountability, educator effectiveness, instructional intervention? Those are three very different purposes, and I know I'm going to hear yes, yes, yes. But I would pick potentially a different model based on which of those purposes I have in mind. So to the extent that you prioritize which of these is most important, it may help you select both your theory of action and the eventual model you're going to use to implement and operationalize that theory of action. Second question, is my model built with student as the unit or school as the unit? Am I measuring school growth or student growth? Why is that important? Because, again, the model that you choose may have higher standards of rigor. You may need, if you're measuring student growth, you may to use a more rigorous model than school evaluation. Why? Because the more data I have, the more reliable my information is, and I can get away with a slightly less reliable assessment if I'm combining all my student scores into a classroom or all my classroom scores into a school. But if my focus is student growth, then I might have to, my most important consideration might be reliability. Because the more units you have, the more reliable you have, just built into it. If you're just doing individual students, then you may need a much longer test or a much different kind of assessment model. And finally, is your system to measure growth within a year or across grades? Because that also will implement the model and the assessment. I'll give the most extreme example, and I'll get into more detail on the next slide. If I measured you today versus tomorrow, I might get growth. But it wouldn't be reliable growth. Chances are you didn't grow that much. You didn't get that much smarter tomorrow than you are today. Therefore, you're basically measuring error. But how much time do I have to wait? Is it reasonable to measure within a year? If I do a pre-test in September, when should I do my next test? How much is reliable growth versus I'm just measuring error? And if I go across grades, should it be every grade? Should it be every other grade? And I need an assessment system that would allow me to do that. And finally, as you're thinking about growth in general, you really need to worry about your audiences. This presentation I'm giving is geared to that middle. I'm going to teach you some Australian now. Australia doesn't have bullets. Australia has dot points. You can think about it culturally or you can think about it traditionally. So my audience of interest right now is educators, that middle dot point. If I was giving this presentation to statisticians, it would be a very different presentation in parts. I would have formulas. I'm not going to have any formulas today. I know you're disappointed. You can come back to the next one. If you can put that in the chat part, and I'll do another one with formulas next time. But if I'm doing this with parents or politicians or the general public, it's a very different presentation. And think about the reports you're going to have from your particular model. It very much depends on who your audience is. Okay, but again, I'm going to end this slide where we started. What is your theory of action? It's a lot of work to do growth. Why are you doing it? Spend more time there and less time on picking your model. Because if you put the work up front, your model will be much more obvious to select. Okay, so now let's deal with factors that are specific to growth that you need to worry about, or what I like to say, that are your challenges that you'll be excited to overcome. Let's just start with the concept of what does 1 year's growth mean? When we say that a student should grow 1 year, from say September year 3 to September year 4. Again, I just gave you some Australian. Australia doesn't have grades, they have years. And it took me 2 years to switch over, and now every now and then I don't just switch back. So what if I'm doing grade to grade? What do I have as my criterion for a successful 1 year growth? Is it the average student growth? Is it the growth of what I've managed in grade 1 and 2 and just continuing? Is it what I need to grow to be proficient? Those are three very different concepts of growth. And there's consequences to who will be a successful or non-successful student or school, depending on which one you use. The problem is that most states or districts or schools that do this don't think about this. They just make the test itself becomes the default 1 year growth. Say the proficient in year 4 or grade 4 to proficient in grade 5 must be 1 year's growth. Or the 50th percentile in year 3 is the same as the 50th percentile in grade 4. It becomes a statistical decision, but is not necessarily a content-driven decision. I think what you should be doing here is looking at learning progressions, looking at students, what's a reasonable amount of growth for that student, for that school, and build off of that. Second point here, same term, different models. People use growth like it means the same thing, like there's only one model. I'm going to switch to the next slide. There's actually a continuum that you need to think about, and there are the two continua. One on the left, I'm going to start with some issues you should use in picking your model, and then talk about 3 types of growth models. So the first one is how complex can you deal with? There are some, I could fill up the page with formulas. I could fill up, and the only way you can do this is a really black box approach. Or I can give you a model that in 5 minutes and 1 graphic, you'll understand the model. And they're both legitimate. They both will measure or demonstrate growth. Your first question, moving to the next bullet, is how much transparency do you need in your model? Back in the early days of accountability, I worked in a state, I won't give a state, where the requirement was if our accountability model can't be determined on a pocket calculator, a handheld calculator, it won't fly. Teachers won't believe us. So we had to build a model with very simple kinds of calculations. And it's the three function one. It's not the one where you turn your iPhone sideways and get all the stuff. It's the one you get when you hold it straight up. So you need to understand how complex, how transparent does your model need to be. Next thing you need to worry about is how much research support, how much analysis has been done on the validity of your model, the reliability of your model. How important is that? Or is transparency and just the obviousness of the results, the eye test, is that sufficient here? How about statistical features that matters? Do you need to have an error band, an error term, so that you can do a statistical model? That's real important. Not every model that's valid and reliable can give you a probability test, can give you a significance test. You need to think about that. And then probably where you should have started, or I should have started, is what are the stakes of your model? Are you going to have formal accountability or just publishing results? Because that will also determine how some of these other pieces here, you may need much more research support and statistical features if this is a formal accountability model versus I just want to publish school results. Okay. So now let's talk about three different classes, three general types of models. The first is real simple, but simple doesn't mean unimportant, or simple doesn't mean, wow, that's not valuable. And that's just a graphic presentation. I'm going to end my part of this with a very simple graphic presentation that I believe is powerful enough to be your growth model. It doesn't have that much research support. There is no error term. I would not use it for formal accountability, but for a lot of purposes, just showing this graph may be sufficient to start the conversation and then allow you to dig deeper. A much more formal model is what's called growth percentiles, student growth percentiles. A lot of states, that's the Colorado growth model is probably the most prominent one, but there are a lot of states or schools using growth percentiles. The way to think about this is very simple conceptually, but not necessarily simple statistically. The way to think about growth percentiles is you can think about it two ways. A student who scores at this particular point in grade 3, where do they need to get to in grade 4 to be proficient? Or let's make it a little more complex. Suppose I say, I've got a student at grade 3. I want that student to be proficient at grade 8. How much growth does that student need to have each year? On the average, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, so that that student will be proficient by grade 8. That's one way of thinking about growth percentiles. Do I make enough progress each year so that by the end, my end point, which is either a grade or a level of proficiency? Because you may not want it to be proficient, because if you have a student who's already proficient, you may want that target to be the advanced standard in your state or your school. That's one way of thinking about this kind of a model. A second way of thinking about it is a little more statistical, but it's still, I think, conceptually relatively easy to get. And that is, let's think about 100 kids across your district or across the state. Let's pick out 25 of them who are at the same starting point. Now let's think about how much they grow from this year to next year, or this year to 3 months from now. I can order these kids from high to low. They're all at the same starting point, so conceivably they all have the same ability level at that point, the same achievement level. In a growth percentile, and here's why they call it percentiles, I've now ordered these kids by same starting point, different end point. And now I could put bands around that percentiles or bands and say you're a high achiever relative to students or schools at your same starting point. Very easy conceptually, little harder necessarily, but it's right in the middle between a graphic presentation. The value of this is the fairness of it, because you're only comparing kids or schools from their same starting point. The disadvantage of a model like this is it's norm referenced. Not everybody can be at that highest growth point. You're actually now ordering kids. So you are just potentially saying that high growth, because it's lower than the highest growth, gets a low percentile. But this is a very appealing model because of its fairness and because of its relative simplicity. The most complex model are value-added models, and these are very heavy-duty statistical models. The best way to describe it is, I want to make an attribution about, say, the effectiveness of a teacher or the effectiveness of a school. And I'm going to use the test results for all the kids in her classroom or in that school. But all these kids have come with very different backgrounds, very different starting points, very different family histories. You've got special ed students, you've got students with English learners, you've got high income and low income kids in that classroom, in that school. If I just computed growth based on time 1 to time 2, it may be unfair to that teacher, because she might have more low performing kids or more reduced lunch kids, or some other teacher may have a whole bunch of high performing kids to begin with. In a value-added model, what we do statistically is we factor out background variables that we believe influence student achievement beyond that teacher's effect. We use a covariate analysis that can remove the impact of being poor, or being an English learner, or being a high achiever, or being a lefty versus a righty. Whatever you believe in your model influences my ability to attribute fairly the achievement of that class, that school, that district, to that teacher, to that principal. Okay. So, I mean, it's obviously a very complex black box operation, but it can be done. So there's advantage to that. The attribution can be relatively straightforward once you've done the magic. But there are two significant disadvantages to this, and I want you to really think through. The first, obviously, is the complexity. I don't know how you got that number, and your model may not be correct. There's a lot of things you've got to trust in your statistics, in your data. You actually need a very strong correlation between, say, free and reduced lunch to achievement. And if you need to be able to apply it fairly across all free and reduced lunch kids, and they may not be the same. So the complexity of the model has significant potential disadvantages. But here's now a political disadvantage to this model. You are saying in your model that kids are different. You may end up having a different trajectory for your African American kids than your Caucasian kids, because the model says that is the best statistical solution. Do you want to, what is the moral, ethical, political, and legal implication of saying literally that I'm expecting less growth from certain students? And if they make less growth, that's about all we can expect from them. My model says that. But the model works. It is a fairest model for that teacher, for that school. But it has all that statistical complication. I was going to use the word baggage. I won't use that. So you really need to think about this continuum of very simple but powerful to a growth percentile, which is easy to understand, but automatically may have some kids on the bottom, even though they've grown well, to these fairly complex value-added models that have strong statistical psychometric principles, but may create political and ethical issues for you. I mean, this is why this is fun. Yeah, Laura?
Yeah, Stanley, I might say something too, and I think you'll get to it in the next one. But one of the things I think I'm curious about, and maybe some of our listeners might be too, we've all heard all three of these pieces, and if it does feel like that value added feels more fair. But how complex is this for a district that, let's say, doesn't have a psychometrician on staff, that may not have the tools to really create what might be or feel really fair and equitable for all teachers, whether it's evaluation or whether it's just really a good growth model to talk about our kids in our classroom?
That's a great question. So
that's really complex.
Let me approach it two ways. The first thing is get the assistance you need. I mean, Pearson would love to work with you. This is not a commercial for Pearson. There are experts who can help you do this. And again, I would get those experts back on slide 1 with theory of action. This is the easy part in a lot of ways, because once you've got that model, my second point is it's just a computer program that, enter the data, it spits it out on the back end, and the good ones come with explanation. The real work, Laura, and everyone else, is the building of the model. Do you have the right model? Do you have the right background indicators? What are the experience of other states or districts doing this? So I'm a lot less concerned about, unless transparency is your number one consideration, I'm a lot less concerned about the black box. I'm worried about what you're putting in that black box. Because if you don't put in the right stuff, the model can't save you. But the middle ground of growth percentiles is a strong model that doesn't have a lot of the black box. It's got some black box, but you can make the kinds of controls. And as I said, it is a norm referenced in a lot of ways consideration. So that's why take a step back, talk to other districts that have done that, and go as you do with, when you redo your bus routes, you bring an expert in. There are sometimes you hire an expert just for a little bit of time or a lot of bit of time. I think this might be a good time to hire one. And then you want to hire me, great. You want to hire, I can also give you 5 other people who are just as good as I am. Nah, not really. Okay. So back a slide. This is complicated. So I'm going to now break a lot of bubbles here. I'm going to burst a bubble here. The biggest hurdle you have to overcome when you're doing growth modeling is doing growth is not as simple as subtracting time 1 from time 2 and getting a score. The reason is that every test has error. And who in this audience believes that measuring something twice will have less error than measuring it once? I've now doubled my error. So it's always, a growth score is always less reliable than time 1 or time 2. And you've got to take that into account. So it's a very important consideration to, again, that will lead to one of my next slides when we talk about having an appropriate assessment. A couple of more preliminary things, conceptual things. Just because I can measure it doesn't mean I have the right attribution for my results. When we started doing growth models back in the early NCLB days, even before ESSA, remember we had required reading and math tests. We wanted accountability for every teacher in the school. So what some states did is said, you know what, it makes a lot of sense to use the reading test for my English teachers, but I'm going to use the reading test for my social studies, science, art, and phys ed teachers. And there was some fairly strong pushback on that. How could I be evaluated on something I didn't teach? Now, I could make an argument through a theory of action that every teacher in that school should be impacting reading scores. But there is a real face validity to argue when I'm being evaluated on a subject I'm not teaching or on a population. I'm the fourth grade teacher. We test science in 3 and 5. I'm being evaluated on tests in 3 and 5. Again, is your attribution appropriate for your test and your measurement model? And finally, reporting. There are a lot of really cool reports, dashboards, graphs that show growth. We've done a lot of work on that. What I would encourage you to do is tailor each of these reports for different populations and not think a one-size-fits-all model will work. So now let's get to the part I really, really like. So what are the technical issues you need to worry about, to overcome when you're doing growth? The first is, and I've talked about this a lot because it's really important, it's true gain versus error. How much growth is enough? And I just want to point out a simple irony to a lot of our growth models. We expect the highest growth in some of our models from our lowest performing kids who have the track record of having lowest growth. Just think about that. That's because our models, as I talked about, some of the student growth percentiles are built around growth to proficient. If you're a grade 3 student and you're building towards 8, it's a reasonable trajectory each year to get to proficient. If you're still not proficient in grade 7 and the model is still grade 8, you pretty much have to go vertical in your growth. What we need to do is balance our models, the expectations of our models, with the reality of where kids are and what's a reasonable amount of growth, or where schools are and what's a reasonable amount of growth. That's one of the nice things some of the growth percentiles do. Okay. You need an assessment designed to support growth. Little known fact outside of the assessment world is that tests are not equally reliable across the entire score scale. I know you're saying, I didn't know that. Maybe you did. Good for you. Most tests are more reliable, most traditional tests anyway, are more reliable in the middle of the test, the middle of the scale. Why? Because that's where we put most of the items. Why? Because that's where most of the kids are. At the bottom of the scale and the top of the scale, results are less reliable because we have fewer items. Why? Because you're not going to give me 9 hours to test your kids. I'm lucky if you give me an hour and then you complain anyway. So one of the advantages of computer adaptive testing that moves the test to kids' ability while they're taking the test is I now have much more reliability at the bottom and the top of the test. Our studies have shown is I can reduce error by 2/3 at the bottom and the top. That means if I'm doing a growth model for low achieving or high achieving kids, I now have much more reliable measurement at those populations, particularly at the bottom, that are the most at risk, that the most I care about in a lot of ways. So having a computer adaptive test or a test with multiple equated forms is crucial if you're doing growth. Just think about what's a great way of doing growth and showing growth. Just give the same test over and over again. Kids will remember. So you need different items. You need multiple equated forms or a large item bank that a cat might have. Okay. Recommended pre-post time frame. How long should you wait to measure growth? We did the silly example of 1 day. Well, what about if that 1 day is when you actually taught the material? Or the week, that was the unit. That may be a good time to measure growth. You have to pick a point in your scope and sequence, where either learning progression says this is a pivotal point, or enough time has passed where most students can be reasonably expected to grow. When we test across grade levels, particularly for our larger urban district where there's a great deal of mobility, we might have a lot of missing cases. You may not be able to match kids from grade to grade. There are approaches you can take where I can actually impute what a student's likely score would have been had he or she stayed in the school. That works statistically. It may not work politically. You mean I'm being evaluated on imaginary kids? That's basically what you're doing. Well, it's a little more than that. I actually have a statistical way to do it, but you may not find that convincing, or you may not be able to convince that principal or that parent. And you certainly won't do it at the student level. I don't have to test anymore. I'm just going to simulate how you would have grown. It will save a lot of money and time, but I don't think that's a great convincing model. Should you just do growth, or should you build growth as part of an index? A lot of the Every Student Succeed Act, the ESSER state accountability models are now more index driven. It's a way of making a more reliable system, still having growth part of it, still having achievement part of it. The question then is, how much should you measure? How much should you include growth in that index? Finally, is growth the dog or is growth the tail? Student achievement is the dog, growth is the tail. A lot of times I see states or districts or schools spending so much time on what model they use, they forget what it's there for. I think the time should be spent on, why are we doing this? That's the dog. And then getting to the tail. So I'm going to move ahead of it. I want to get to a very simple exercise that I've done around the world and around the country. And it's a way of maybe focusing your theory of action on growth. And it starts with a very simple question. What's a successful school? And now I walk you through an exercise where we think about a 4 quadrants, a 2-dimensional model. It's a more complex model. It's a 2-dimensional model where the traditional 1-dimensional models is just achievement. I'm going to add growth. And I can imagine 4 quadrants, cleverly named 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, we can all agree that quadrant 4 is our nirvana. Everyone wants every school to be a quadrant 4 school. High achievement and high growth. That's easy. If I was building an accountability model, that would get the most points. We also have to look very closely at quadrant 1 schools. Low achievement, low growth. What's going on? Why? What are the factors there? This is not naming and shaming. This is what's going on. Let's see what we can do. Let's see the ESSA identification of the lowest performing schools. This is what this is about. Now we get a little more complex. If you were building your accountability model, which would you give more points to? Quadrant 2 or quadrant 3? And I think you can see my bias because I named quadrant 2, and quadrant 3. A high achieving, low growth school, or a high growth, lower achieving school. And that becomes a wonderful exercise that can now help you decide how you're going to pick your growth model. But more importantly, it's your theory of action of how do you balance growth and achievement. And now I promised you a graphic demonstration built off of this model. These are real data. Every one of those dots is a school. The achievement axis, the x-axis, is achievement in grade 5. The y-axis is growth of matching kids from year 3 to year 5, with the caveat that you have to have at least 15 kids matched, just so it's not all error. And you've got the quadrants. Those gold schools are schools that actually had extraordinarily high growth from 2 years ago to this year. So these are real data. These are real schools. This is a very powerful growth model. Now, what I can't do is explain what happened. I can't tell you what's necessarily enough growth there. But what I can do is identify you in this quadrant. And most importantly, when you tell me that you can't do something, I hear that from quadrant 1 schools. You don't understand my population. You don't understand our resources. What I'm able to do through an index that was created is identify a quadrant 3 school with the exact same index as you have of student population, of student features. And they're a high growth school. They're a quadrant 3 school. And I want those principals, those teachers to talk to each other. What did you do to become a high growth school? In my perfect world, quadrant 1 schools become quadrant 3 schools, quadrant 3 schools become quadrant 4 schools, and quadrant 2 schools become quadrant 4 schools. And it's a trajectory. Having this model, there's no statistics here. There's a little bit, but this is basically a graphic demonstration of every elementary school in this state. And it's a really fascinating discussion about what did you do to become a quadrant 4 school? What do I need to move from quadrant to quadrant? So Laura, I'm going to stop there and now turn it over to you. So thank you for your attention so far.
Thanks. And we just got a little bit more, and then I want to get to some questions and some things that have showed up in the chat. I just want to turn our attention a little bit. You know, one of the things that I value most about Pearson is, to the point Stanley makes, is they do some research and pride themselves on that. And I feel fortunate to be working for a company that's asking questions. And for just like teachers and administrators that are on with us, we asked some questions. And one of those was, what can we do to make the state of assessment better? And keep in mind, we're talking primarily about those interim assessments that maybe a district might give or a state might give. Of course, we're always working toward making that state assessment better, but primarily we're talking now about those interim pieces. Not that we don't value, for sure, a teacher's formative work that they do and how important that is on a regular basis. So one of the things, and I don't think anybody would disagree, that we need to improve this system, and we for sure need to improve the system, especially as we look at those end of year assessments and what those mean to us. And so Pearson's listening, and we're paying close attention to that. I think especially when we think about this world of interim assessments, and a point that Stanley made early on, we are concerned about the fact that how students perform then may result in how teachers are impacted on that, and whether that's their evaluation or, you know, and even when we think about those students who come to us sometimes not having been in our classroom for very long and yet are taking the test, that mobility is always an issue. And we also know that it does take away, testing does take away from our teaching time. And so Pearson is looking at how might we support this. And I think the other piece, and Stanley somewhat mentioned this a little bit, and that is, it always feels disconnected, and did to me too when I worked in a district, and that I'm giving assessments that I had not taught that information yet. I hadn't gotten to that section or that unit. It wasn't part of my scope and sequence yet. I wasn't going to get that till April, so no wonder they didn't understand that in September. And that was always a level of frustration for the thousands of teachers that I supported in the district where I was at, and even when I was a classroom teacher. So we're addressing that. And one of the things that I feel fortunate about is this newest piece, this innovation that we've been working on. It's called Transcend. And what we're working on to truly create to Stanley's point earlier, truly a computer adaptive test so that we really can garner reliable data that, especially around growth data, that really means something to us, and especially means something to me as a classroom teacher because I just got done teaching. It's based on local scope and sequence. It is not an off-the-shelf test. And even when those off-the-shelf tests may align to your state standards, we have a lot of autonomy around our own scope and sequence in every district, which I love. And we don't want to move away from that. And that's one of the benefits, I think, to this particular newest interim. And that is this idea that we're going to align to your local scope and sequence as well as your state standards. They are computer adaptive. So that reliability, but most importantly, because of that, it shortens the test. We're only testing students on what they need to be tested on or ones that they, questions that they haven't been taught on yet. But most importantly for me is that it stays within grade level because that's what I'm teaching too, are those state standards in that particular grade level. And I think it's really important that we do that. Another piece that I think is really important in this newest innovation, which is a little away from growth, but it is cognitively appropriate. We're not jumping around from domain to domain in asking those questions. We're asking those questions somewhat in a logical order for a student to cognitively understand without that level of frustration. And I felt like that was one of our most unique pieces of this design, along with aligning to a local scope and sequence, but to really make sure that we're helping support those students as they take these interims. So essentially, to optimize this instructional validity, this is where we get into a little bit of what Stanley's going to take us to next, as far as sort of explaining how we're doing this a little differently in terms of calculating growth, especially as it relates to your own local scope and sequence.
Okay, I'm just going to take a very short time, 30 seconds, and then let's get to the question.
Sure.
The key here is having sufficient number of questions to reliably measure and report that part of your scope and sequence. So one of the problems with a lot of these interim systems is they just report out as if the data are necessarily reliable and valid. What our model is, through the computer adaptation and the selection of different items, is we pick just the right number of items and the just right unit of reporting. So you may not be able to get to the skill level, but you can get to the domain level or the cluster level. And if that's what's most important to you, because that's where you're now going to focus instruction, this model will, in the shortest amount of time, build you towards that kind of information. And because it's built around your scope and sequence, every bit of data you're getting through our reports is actionable. You've just taught that. You can now do an audit of your students, see who's learned, see where you've got larger issues, and build off of there. So, Laura, we're happy to do more. Let's talk to people about Transcendence some other time, but let's now get to the questions, make sure we have enough time to do that.
Absolutely, yes, and we'll close that out with how to contact us if you're interested in that newest product. But I think one of the questions, Stanley, that they brought up, and just to be clear, you know, when we talk about reliable tests, you know, it probably feels like those should be created by a company, not necessarily teacher created. How do you help a teacher understand, you know, and really differentiate what we're trying to talk about as far as that reliability around hundreds of test questions that have been calibrated, but still it's so important of those formative assessments that teachers do, not to take away from that for sure.
Yeah, so I'm going to really, I don't know how helpful this is going to be, but I'm going to really give a very strong bias. And there are people who I think are really smart say this, so I'm going to stand behind it. Remember we talked about stakes before. What are you using this model for? If you are using this model for high stakes accountability, then you need a much more professional test. If you're using this for auditing student achievement and reporting back and teacher intervention, then I'm very happy to have a teacher-driven assessment. So it's the purpose that drives this, and it's all about lawsuits, and it's all about fairness, and it's all about accountability. So where are you in the continuum? If it's just feedback to teachers, it's a different animal of kinds of assessment. I'm very happy with informal and formal classroom activities, and I think that's part of a formative instructional system, very important. If, on the other hand, it's formal accountability, you need to use a Transcend. You need to use your state accountability test.
Great. Another question that came up, and we know that some states and districts, some charters have some flexibility in terms of selecting their growth model. And you mentioned early on, Stanley, that it's so important to talk through what's the purpose of growth. Any other how we work with those leaders to determine what might be their best growth model? Maybe that's sort of a good recap of how do we start that conversation of our best growth model as it applies to our districts.
One of the best exercises I had at the beginning of this kind of operation was that simple graphic I had with the 2 dimensions, without the data, with the four quadrants. You bring together stakeholders and you just walk them through a very powerful discussion. And you get the values of your stakeholders there. The biggest, like I said, quadrant 1 and 4 are easy. Quadrant 2 and 3, I've seen really, really passionate, deep discussions. A quadrant 2 school saying, hey, my kids are topped out. The test, we're very happy with our results. We may not have grown, but we've really shown we can do this test. Where a quadrant 3 school says, for the first time, I felt I'm being treated fairly. That those quadrant 2 schools, which may not be doing much value added, are always winning in our accountability game. So starting with your stakeholders and then doing your due diligence as you would in any textbook adoption, selection of your tests, whatever. Talk to neighboring districts, talk to people you respect, and go from there.
Great. I think we have time. It is 5 o'clock, but we just have another question added, and I want to check on that. Well, and actually it's a comment a little bit, I think it's an editorial comment a little bit about, why doesn't this knowledge around assessments versus what a state requires translate to our state legislators and our education departments? I think we've all felt that frustration at some time in our life, right, Stanley, as far as it feels like sometimes they're not listening, right?
Well, I am happy if you invite me or you invite Laura to your legislature. We will show up. I will modify this. On my segment of audiences, legislators may not be by the statisticians, so we'll probably have something a little less sophisticated. I think they need this information. Again, too much is placed in the hands of experts and not enough in the hands of stakeholders and users. There's a role for experts, but it really does start with, what do you want to accomplish? What do your parents care about? What does your public care about? And what will your teachers use to modify behavior and improve achievement? That's why we do growth. That's why we teach.
That's right. That's right. Just the last slide about Transcend. Again, if this is something that you think you'd like to learn more about, please don't hesitate to use my email or my phone number. And if it's a question I can't answer, Stanley will be able to answer. He's the expert. We can't thank you enough for joining us. Again, if you'd like to follow us or call us, don't hesitate. Happy to talk. And join the EdWeb community. I think you'll find the recordings that are very helpful, and you can earn that certificate, download slides, and continue that chatting with members that have already been on. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of our afternoon, and have a great evening.